Okay, guys, let's talk a little bit about selection and actually picking some employees to work for us. And so, as we kind of talked about, we're going to do a job analysis, which is going to really detail what the position that we're looking for is going to be like. So, the description part of it, an example here is that's the summary here, the accountabilities, the dimensions. This is the description of what it's going to be like on a day-to-day basis in the job. Then we get to the specification part, and that's down at the bottom, that knowledge and skills, where it's going to list the education and any skill requirements, any number of years required experience that you want people to have. And the idea is that we create this and we post it, a job posting, and people can see it and they can determine whether they are qualified or not qualified themselves. Because what we really want is we don't want just anyone to apply, we want qualified applicants. So when we're recruiting, we're looking for qualified applicants. And so we can go inside or outside the firm to find those applicants. If we go outside, it's called external recruiting. And there's advantages and disadvantages of doing both types of recruiting. External can be very expensive, okay? And to give you an example, I interviewed with Lockheed Martin for an HR job, and they traveled around the country to all these colleges. They sent recruiters, and we met with them, and they selected some of us, 100 actually, of us to then go interview for positions with them. And so what they did is they actually paid for us. So for 100 people, they flew us all to Florida, to Orlando, Florida, put us up in a hotel and for the weekend while they interviewed all of us to determine whether they wanted to bring us on with their company. and that's very expensive. You're flying people all over the country to go to college campuses, and then you pick the applicants. You're flying 100 applicants, and so it's pretty expensive to actually go through the external. However, you do get people with, various backgrounds and new perspectives of how to do business. Internal, though, one advantage is that it's motivation for your employees to move up, helps you retain quality people, but it does leave another position to open. So you move someone up, and all you've done is you've created a new opening that you now have to fill. And so you have increased costs because you have to spend time hiring 2 positions and training 2 employees. And so some of the costs get doubled that way. All right, so the actual selection part. So there's a lot of different ways we can do selection. The most common 2 that you're probably familiar with would be employment application and interview. So applications today are pretty much all done online through companies' websites. And then most widely used would be an interview, where they bring people in and have them and ask them questions to find out more about them and their experiences and determine whether they're a good fit with their company. References is another thing that companies do. They might call your references and get an idea of your work history and the way you interacted and worked with others. Assessment center, that's usually more higher level jobs where you might send someone to go take some tests to determine whether they have the abilities to do the job. And of course, social networking sites like LinkedIn specifically are ways for people to network and find jobs. And I would say that that's not necessarily a selection technique as much as a recruiting technique, where we are looking at LinkedIn and Facebook to find people that we would then interview potentially. So when we do selection, though, we do have some things that we have to consider. One of the big downfalls in the selection process is discrimination. And that's because no matter how hard we try, it is impossible to remove all of these protected classes from consideration when doing this selection process. So Title VII Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination based on sex, race, color, religion, and national origin. All right, but just by seeing someone's name, you can infer some things. You might infer their sex. You might infer their race or national origin. And so just when you see someone's name, you can already start to have an impact or have some discrimination come into play, because we make assumptions about people when we read their names and when they walk through the door and we see them for the first time. Okay. Sometimes those assumptions are correct, and sometimes those assumptions are not correct. But we do make those assumptions. Now, what discrimination says is that we shouldn't allow these things to take play in making that decision. There's Stephen Levitt is his name, and him and a friend of his wrote a book called Freakonomics, and they look at all sorts of different things. But one of the things that they looked at, and you can go to their website and find it, but is that they sent out resumes with names on the resumes. And so they sent out a certain number of resumes with traditional Anglo-American names and a certain number with African-American names. And what they wanted to see is okay, these resumes are identical except for the name at the top. Do they get called back at the same rate? Do they get asked for interviews at the same rate? Because they should, because the qualifications are all the same. And what they found out is what I mentioned to you just a minute ago, is that when you see that name, you can infer male or female. You can infer race, color, national origin from that. Sometimes even religion. And so the African American names didn't get called back at the same rate as the Anglo-American names. And so we have to be mindful of this. And when we look at Title VII, there's actually two types of discrimination that can result. One's called disparate impact, and that just says that we have an employment practice that's having an adverse impact on one group over another. Okay, whether we intentionally or unintentionally meant for that to happen, it's happening, and it's having a disparate impact. Okay, so that's an interesting thing too, is that discrimination doesn't mean that you had to purposely treat someone differently. It just means that maybe someone is being treated differently, even though we didn't mean to treat them different, and so we need to remedy that. So an example of that would be, let's say I had a restaurant, and I have these tall 8-foot shelves in my restaurant, and I want tall people so they can reach the shelves when it gets busy and they don't have to get a stool out. And so what I do is I implement this simple little test, and when people come in for their interview, I just make them reach up and I see if they can grab something off the shelf. If they can grab something off the shelf, we continue with the interview. If not, I say I'm sorry, and we don't continue with the interview. Okay? And so the whole reason for my test is because I want people who can reach that top shelf. It has nothing to do with who the people are in terms of sex, race, color, religion, or national origin. But what you'll find is that certain people will fail at a greater rate. So females would tend to fail at a greater rate than males. Asian, Hispanic would probably fail at a greater rate than African American and Caucasian. And so we would be having a disparate impact. Now, my intended purpose of that was not to purposely create this test that would eliminate Asians because I don't like Asians. It was because I wanted to get tall workers so that they could reach that shelf. Okay, but that doesn't negate the fact that it is having a disparate impact, and so then is not allowed. So when we have employment tests, we can run afoul of disparate impact. Now there is a special scenario when we would allow disparate impact, essentially, and that's when we would say that, number one, the test is a valid predictor of job performance, and two, that it's an essential function of the job. In other words, you can't do the job without doing this item, and the test that we're doing actually tests on whether you can do that. Okay, so female firefighters tend to fail at a greater rate than male firefighters in their physical tests that they do. However, that's been upheld and said that no, that's okay because firefighters are going to have to lift heavy hoses. They're going to have to go into buildings, and when they find me in a building, they're going to have to be able to pull me out, and so they're going to have to be able to lift a certain amount of weight, and so they've allowed that in that case. The other type of discrimination is called disparate treatment. This is 100% willful, purposefully treating someone different based on one of those protected classes, those sex, race, color, religion, or national origin. And so we can't eliminate this one 100%, as I mentioned, because as soon as someone walks in, you can infer things about them. However, we can try to prevent some of it. So on the interviews, we want to use what's called a structured interview, and that just means that we're going to ask every single person the same set of questions, okay? And we're not going to stray from them. That way, everyone gets asked the same questions, and there's no questions that would open up for the possibility of discriminating. It also actually helps so that we can compare applicant to applicant better, because we're comparing their answers to the same questions. So it's a better method anyway, but it will help prevent some of that disparate treatment as well. And so that's selection in a nutshell. Thanks, guys.